What if Britain had made peace with Hitler in 1940? Picture Trafalgar Square empty at dusk. Statues lit by sodium lamps, a city that once prepared for invasion suddenly quieter. Its docks less crowded with convoy flags, its newspapers carrying an armistice rather than a declaration of, "We shall fight on." That single political turning point would not simply remove one combatant from the map. It would redraw incentives, free resources, and force choices inside Berlin, Moscow, Washington, and across an empire. The question isn't only whether Germany could win faster or more decisively. It's how the mechanics of war, logistics, production, institutional incentives, and global politics would reconfigure the strategic landscape. This is an analysis of those mechanisms, not a claim about inevitability. Baseline: the hinge moment in late 1940. By late 1940, the immediate catastrophe that many feared for Britain had not occurred. The British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk. The Royal Navy still controlled significant sea lanes, and the Royal Air Force had blunted the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Britain. Winston Churchill had made the decision to continue the fight. These are the real-world facts we pivot from. Now imagine a plausible counterfactual. Rather than continuing the war, Britain negotiates a peace settlement with Germany. Crucial details: what terms such a peace would include, whether Britain would keep control of its empire, how its government would be constituted, are indefinito. Because those specifics materially affect outcomes, I will treat them as branching assumptions and lay out the downstream mechanisms that would follow under alternative plausibilities. Immediate military effects. What Germany could reallocate. The clearest mechanical effect of British neutrality or peace would be the freeing of German forces and materiel tied up in the West. If London ceased active resistance, the Wehrmacht and Kriegsmarine would no longer need to maintain large garrisons in occupied Western Europe or commit Luftwaffe sorties over the Channel and home islands. Ships, aircraft, divisions, and the industrial focus that underwrote them could be turned toward other theaters. The Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, the Mediterranean and North Africa, and efforts to strangle Allied supply lines to the USSR. Think in systems terms. War is a flow of resources, men, machines, fuel, steel, managed under constraints. One theater closed reduces the denominator of demand and raises the marginal return to reallocating assets to remaining fronts. Operationally, freeing the Western Front could yield several concrete possibilities. Air power. Luftwaffe units previously slated for channel operations might be reassigned to massed air support for a renewed push east. Greater availability of close air support, reconnaissance, and strategic bombing could improve operational tempo. Yet air power requires bases, logistics, trained crews, and replacement aircraft. Shifting wings does not automatically solve production limits. Armor and mechanized units. Tanks and armored divisions tied down in garrison or coastal defense could move east or south. Concentrated armored formations can achieve breakthroughs, but they burn fuel and maintenance capacity at high rates. Elite units, those kept constantly in action without rotation, tend to produce spectacular short-term results at unsustainable long-term cost. This is attrition economics in action. Naval focus. Without the necessity of contesting the English Channel, the Kriegsmarine could redirect U-boats and surface raiders toward the Atlantic lanes that supply the Soviet Union via the Arctic, or to the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean to attack shipping to British colonies. U-boat operations could also be intensified in a narrower window without the continuous need to protect the channel approaches. But the German Navy remained constrained by hull production, crew training, and most importantly, fuel and access to ports. All of these reallocations increased German tactical options. That said, there are clear limits. Germany's industrial base and raw material supply, especially oil, rubber, and certain strategic metals, were finite. Reallocating existing units might produce stronger offensives in the short term, but long-term strategic power depends on sustained production and supply. A temporary redeployment could accelerate early gains, yet without a commensurate increase in production and secure supply lines, those gains risk overextension. Mini CTA. If you want more counterfactual systems analysis like this, hit subscribe. Institutional dynamics inside Nazi Germany. Two divergent equilibria. Mechanics alone don't decide wars. institutions and incentives do. Inside Nazi Germany, the competition between the Wehrmacht's professional officers and the political security apparatus around Hitler, the SS and its leadership, was an ongoing engine of inefficiency and contradiction. In a world where Britain made peace, that engine would face a new set of incentives. Two plausible institutional trajectories could emerge, each producing very different strategic outcomes. Scenario A. The regime doubles down on ideological instruments. Assumption: the peace emboldens Hitler politically, reducing immediate external checks. In this variant, Hitler and the Nazi political apparatus might view the moment as an opportunity to consolidate ideological priorities. Expanding SS authority, promoting politically reliable but operationally inefficient formations, and prioritizing racial or ideological goals over purely military efficiency. Mechanism and consequences. If ideological imperatives strengthened, resources could be diverted to create and maintain expensive prestige units and projects, Waffen-SS formations, security apparatuses in occupied territories, and politically oriented economic programs. These units typically consume disproportionate resources relative to their battlefield longevity. The result would be faster, more dramatic offensives in some sectors, but at higher attrition and administrative cost. Such a pattern can produce short-term territorial gains while undermining long-term sustainability. Moreover, an SS-led approach would intensify brutality in occupied areas, fueling resistance that imposes occupation costs and drains manpower and materiel, effects that are strategically adverse even if ideologically consistent for the regime. Moral framing. The Waffen-SS and related organizations were instruments of Nazi crimes and should be described as such. Any scenario that empowers them more centrally would likely deepen criminal policies and the human cost of occupation. This is not a neutral administrative shift. It magnifies a regime's ideological violence. Scenario B. Wehrmacht pragmatists reassert control. Assumption: military necessity reasserts itself, and professional officers regain operational priority over ideological commissars. In this trajectory, the Wehrmacht prioritizes efficient allocation, rotating units, preserving combat power, and seeking sustainable lines of supply for long campaigns. Mechanism and consequences. Under Wehrmacht-led planning, resources freed by a British peace could be concentrated sensibly. Stockpiles of fuel routed to main axes, armored formations rotated to avoid burnout, and a more disciplined approach to occupation that aims to minimize partisan overhead. This approach could convert initial advantages into deeper operational reach without commensurate increases in attrition. Yet even a pragmatic Wehrmacht faces structural limits: constrained production, shortages of strategic materials, and the logistical burden of operating across vast distances. Efficiency improves prospects, but it does not erase foundational constraints. Uncertainty and tipping points. Both scenarios are plausible. Which one would happen hinges on politics in Berlin, how Hitler perceives his margin of safety after a British peace, the strength of rival bureaucracies, and whether external shocks, e.g., a U.S. trade embargo, Soviet resistance, create immediate pressures that favor one coalition over the other. These internal dynamics are indefinido, without a fully specified counterfactual settlement. Strategic consequences for the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was the central theater where the war's long-term outcome would likely be decided. If Germany could reallocate forces from the West and intensify pressure on the USSR earlier or in greater mass, how might that change the campaign's rhythm and result? Short-term possibilities. With more divisions, aircraft, and armor available, the Wehrmacht could have aimed for deeper penetrations, faster encirclements, or simultaneous operations on multiple axes. Improved air cover and recon could blunt Soviet counterattacks and disrupt mobilization efforts. A German command that had greater freedom to stage logistics, airfields closer to the front, railheads extended, might have avoided some tactical failures caused by overstretched lines, structural limits that blunt success. But even with additional material, several structural factors make decisive, long-term German victory unlikely under most plausible scenarios. Industry and replacement capacity. Germany could win battles, capture territory, and destroy Soviet armies. victory in wartime terms requires not only winning battles, but replacing losses and sustaining campaigns across seasons. Soviet industrial production, especially after relocation east of the Urals and with growing Allied support, had latent capacity that could be brought to bear. Germany's own factories, while formidable, were not unlimited. Attrition would eventually favor the side that could replace men and machines more reliably. Oil and logistics. Germany's mechanized advance required fuel at an industrial scale. Securing sufficient oil, whether from Romanian fields, seized Caucasus resources, or synthetic fuel, was always problematic. Without a dramatic verifiable resolution to the oil problem, extended offensives bogged down. Winter and poor infrastructure amplify consumption. More tanks and trucks only help if they can be fed and repaired. Geography and manpower. The USSR could trade space for time. Even significant encirclements and defeats did not necessarily translate into strategic collapse. Soviet manpower reserves and capacity to mobilize, even under heavy losses, present a different kind of attrition curve than Germany faced in Western Europe. Seasonality. A faster start or heavier force concentration could improve German prospects before the winter, but Russia's climate and infrastructure impose natural brakes on rapid, sustained offensives. Transport and maintenance degrade quickly in mud and snow. Given these constraints, the most plausible effect of Western peace is to increase the scale and speed of German offensives in the short run, pushing deeper and perhaps capturing more territory before winter 1941-42. Whether that translates into total victory depends on replacement capacity, access to oil, and Soviet political resilience. All of these remain major uncertainties that must be stated explicitly. Global political and economic effects. The United States, Empire, and colonies. A British peace would create ripple effects far beyond Europe. Three broad geopolitical levers matter. The United States reaction, the fate of Britain's imperial architecture, and neutral or colonial actors' calculations. U.S. reaction. Two divergent branches. Scenario A. Extended American isolationism. Assumption. A British peace reduces the immediacy of the German threat to Western Europe in American eyes. Domestic politics in the United States, combined with 1940-41 isolationist sentiment, could delay large-scale intervention. In this branch, the U.S. might continue to prefer material support short of full-scale engagement, and Lend-Lease could be attenuated or redirected. Without the visceral image of British survival under siege, American public opinion could be less willing to push for direct confrontation. Consequences. A delayed U.S. military entry prolongs the period during which Germany can exploit freed resources. American industrial power, however, remains a latent factor. If Washington chooses to ramp up production even without immediate entry, it can tilt the balance later. If it remains isolationist, Germany benefits tactically for longer. Scenario B. Accelerated American mobilization and intervention. Assumption. A British peace, rather than calming Washington, alarms it. American policymakers and industrial leaders may interpret the settlement as a strategic consolidation by Germany that imperils U.S. interests and global trade. Under this reading, the U.S. might accelerate naval and materiel support to the USSR and Commonwealth forces, or move earlier toward direct engagement. Consequences. Early American mobilization could offset German gains by supplying Soviet production, protecting convoys with stronger escort forces, and putting pressure on German strategic supply lines. American entry could also drive a long-term industrial imbalance in favor of the Allies. Which branch is more likely depends on complex, indefinito elements. U.S. domestic politics, perception of German intentions. Did a British peace represent a stable European order or a stepping stone to wider aggression? And strategic calculations about global security. The key point. American policy is a major contingent variable that could swing outcomes. British Empire and colonial dynamics. If Britain negotiates peace without relinquishing its empire, colonial possessions and dominions face new dilemmas. Some dominions might accept neutrality, others could resist arrangements perceived as betrayal. Local political actors could interpret a British armistice as an opportunity to push for autonomy or to side with other powers. Colonial troops and administrators form part of the global order. Their cooperation or withdrawal would affect shortages of manpower, raw materials, and logistical reach. Conversely, a British settlement that erodes metropolitan authority in the empire could create openings for German influence and local alignments, hostile to the Axis or hostile to any single hegemon. These effects are highly context-dependent and therefore indefinido, without explicit peace terms. Supply lines and choke points. Much of the long-term dynamics hinge on control of the seas, choke points, and the ability to keep supply flowing. If the Royal Navy retained at least a degree of operational capacity in the counterfactual, it could continue to protect convoys and maintain pressure on German supply routes. If the peace included a debilitating reduction in British naval activity, whether voluntarily or coerced, Germany could exploit the gap to interdict supply routes, reducing Allied material support to the USSR and increasing pressure on distant colonies. Again, the specifics are critical and indefinido. Wildcards, occupation costs, resistance, and internal German politics. Beyond the structured channels above, several wildcards could radically alter outcomes. Resistance and partisan warfare. Occupation breeds resistance. The more brutal the occupation, especially under stronger SS control, the more local populations mobilize guerrilla campaigns. Partisan warfare can siphon German troops, impose occupation costs, and disrupt logistics. These phenomena were already evident in many occupied territories and would likely intensify where Nazi ideological control was stronger. Occupation economics. Maintaining a large occupation force across Europe and an extended front in the East imposes enormous economic and administrative burdens. Garrison duty reduces the pool of combat-ready divisions and increases the demand for secure lines of communication. Occupation requires policing, infrastructure, and continual supply, resources that could otherwise support frontline offensives. German internal politics. Even absent external shocks, internal power struggles between the Wehrmacht, the SS, the party bureaucracy, and industrial magnates could produce erratic or inefficient policy choices. Leadership choices in Berlin are unpredictable. They could accelerate a pragmatic approach or plunge the regime into ideological overreach. These are political wildcards with strategic consequences. Synthesis. Plausible end states and their assumptions. Bringing the mechanisms together, a few coherent end states emerge as plausible, each contingent on specific assumptions that must be acknowledged. End state 1, short-term German dominance, long-term uncertainty, most plausible under many parameter values. Core mechanisms. British peace frees forces. German command concentrates these resources against the USSR. Initial offensives achieve deeper territorial gains before winter. Institutional control is either pragmatic Wehrmacht-driven or a mixed approach where tactical successes are prioritized. Key assumptions. U.S. response is delayed or measured. German industry can maintain near-current production rates. Oil shortages are mitigated only partially. Occupation costs are manageable in the near term. Soviet resilience is strained but not broken. Uncertainties. Can Germany convert early battlefield gains into a strategic collapse of the USSR? That depends principally on oil, replacement capacity, and the scale and timing of American assistance. Without a decisive solution to fuel and production bottlenecks, early territorial gains might prove reversible. End state 2, prolonged stalemate and eventual German overreach, plausible under other common parameter values. Core mechanisms. German tactical gains from reallocation are offset by intensified partisan resistance, occupation costs, and the intrinsic limits of production. The SS's empowerment leads to harsh occupation policies, fueling resistance and administrative breakdown. Meanwhile, American industrial output and lend-lease, whether direct or indirect, accumulate, and Soviet mobilization recovers. Key assumptions. Political choices in Berlin favor ideological dominance or inefficient prioritization. U.S. industrial support either accelerates or remains latent but sufficient to sustain the Soviets. Colonial and neutral actors deny Germany unchallenged resources. Uncertainties. The timing of American intervention and exact occupation dynamics. Both can tip the balance away from a German long-term success. End state 3. A negotiated continental order under Axis hegemony, low probability but not impossible under particular conditions. Core mechanisms. A British settlement might come with conditions that preserve certain imperial prerogatives or neutrality that materially weaken Allied cohesion. If the U.S. remains isolationist and key neutral players cooperate, Germany could consolidate control over Eurasian landmass resources sufficiently to impose a long-term, if uneasy, continental order. Key assumptions. The United States maintains prolonged neutrality. British imperial control remains intact in crucial regions or collapses into manageable arrangements. Germany secures or substitutes for critical raw materials, particularly oil. Uncertainties and moral note. This scenario diminishes Allied capacity to resist on a continental scale and raises deeply troubling moral questions about what concessions are tolerable. It is important to state plainly, any scenario that normalizes or extends Nazi political control would deepen crimes against humanity and is morally abhorrent. The analysis of mechanisms must not be read as endorsement. Assessing probabilities and limits of inference. How confident can we be in any of these end states? Not highly. Counterfactual history is not a statistical exercise that yields precise probabilities. It is an exploration of mechanism and sensitivity. The most robust conclusions are structural and conditional. Reallocating military forces by itself improves operational options for Germany in the short run. That is plausible and mechanismally sound. Long-term success depends on structural factors, industrial replacement capacity, access to oil, and the opponent's ability to absorb losses and mobilize industry. These constraints are harder to change via political deals and are therefore the limiting factors on strategic victory. Institutional choices inside Germany, whether toward pragmatic conservation or ideological escalation, could materially alter outcomes because they affect attrition rates and occupation efficiency. The United States' reaction is a major contingent variable. If American industrial and military power is brought to bear decisively, it can overwhelm German gains over time. Occupation costs and resistance matter. A regime that emphasizes ideological domination imposes long-term drag on military effectiveness. Given those structural truths, the most defensible verdict is cautionary. A British peace in 1940 would likely have given Germany operational breathing room and could have produced deeper, earlier gains against the Soviet Union. But turning those gains into a durable, uncontested continental victory required overcoming production, logistical, and resource bottlenecks. Problems that political agreements alone would not fix. In many plausible branches, German overreach, partisan resistance, or delayed but powerful American mobilization would combine to make long-term victory unlikely. Climax. The core insight. The compelling lesson from this counterfactual is not about a single decision, Dunkirk, a treaty, or a battle, but about systems. Wars are decided by flows and constraints. How quickly can an economy convert factories into tanks? How reliably can a logistics chain deliver fuel? How do bureaucratic incentives reward or punish conservation versus aggression? When you shift one node, Britain's continued resistance or sudden peace, you change the flows, but you do not instantly rewrite physics. Institutions respond in predictable and unpredictable ways. Material bottlenecks reassert themselves even as political seams fray. A final moral framing. Analyzing how Nazi Germany might have been more effective if Britain had accepted peace does not, and must not, sanitize the regime's crimes. Any scenario that increases Nazi leverage risks extending suffering. The question we ask is strategic and mechanical, not moral approval. Terror and oppression are not mere variables to be optimized. They are human tragedies whose expansion must be unequivocally condemned. Conclusion and invitation. So what if Britain had made peace with Hitler in 1940? The short answer: it would have changed the game's geometry, more resources for Germany, altered institutional dynamics, and a very different set of international responses. But whether that change produces decisive, durable victory for Germany is far from certain. The dynamics of production, supply, resistance, and American power create powerful counterweights. Mechanisms matter more than single moments. Which mechanism would you bet on if forced to choose? Resources and industry, institutional choices inside Germany, or American intervention? Tell us in the comments which single change you think would have mattered most. If you found this systems-based counterfactual interesting, like the video and subscribe for more analyses that go beyond battles to the machinery behind historical outcomes.